Claire was a homeless woman, her life reduced to a torn backpack that held everything she had left in the world. He was a notorious crime boss, wealthy, powerful, and ruthless, distraught because his daughter had less than one day to live. When his men dragged her off a cold New York sidewalk and shoved her into a black van, Claire Whitmore had no idea what was happening. All she knew was that if she could not prove her innocence, she would have no chance of surviving. What she did not expect was that the journey to save James DeLuca's little girl would not only change that child's life, but would utterly transform Claire's own life, beginning with a deal no one had ever dared place on the table with this mob boss before. The winter night was so cold she could no longer feel her fingers. Claire huddled outside an old church in Lower Manhattan, the wind from the Hudson River slipping through the thin seams of her coat. A piece of cardboard with "Please help" scrawled on it sat in front of her next to a paper cup holding a few loose coins. It had been 3 days since she had eaten anything except a packet of cookies tossed aside after a charity event. She had grown used to being invisible, to people walking past as if she did not exist. But tonight was different. A black van arrived without warning, no headlights, no sound. Claire only had time to look up before 3 men in black leapt out, yanked her up like she was a sack, and forced her into the vehicle. She struggled and screamed, but one of them slipped a coarse cloth sack over her head and the world closed into darkness. She was thrown into the back, her hands bound with plastic ties, the van speeding away with tires screaming. The smell of sweat, leather, and motor oil flooded her nostrils, mixed with the tightening fear in her chest. She did not know where she was being taken or why. A man in the van read from his phone. Height 1.65 meters, dark brown hair, thin build, seen near Broadway at about 10 o'clock p.m. Claire tried to speak, to explain, but they would not listen. She knew resistance was useless. She could only pray that this was not the end of her. When the van stopped and she was hauled out, the cold air hit her face like a slap. The sack was ripped away, and a cold fluorescent light stabbed into her eyes. Claire blinked hard to adjust, and when she could make out the old concrete room around her, chains dangling from the ceiling and old bloodstains on the walls, her heart nearly stopped. A metal chair sat in the middle of the room, and she was shoved into it, her hands bound tight. The door opened, and a man entered, tall, composed, wearing a perfectly tailored black suit, salt and pepper hair neatly combed, his face as cold as stone. But it was his eyes that terrified her most, deep, impassive, as if they had looked upon hundreds of dead without blinking. James DeLuca needed no introduction. Claire had heard that name when she worked as a nurse at St. Joseph's Hospital, where victims of gang violence had filled the emergency rooms. She had never imagined she would one day sit in his interrogation room. He did not shout. He walked forward, placed his hands on the chair's back, looked directly at her, and spoke in a voice so steady it was terrifying. "You poisoned my daughter." Claire's hands tightened against the binding. "I don't know what you're talking about. I don't even know you have a daughter," she managed. He did not answer immediately. Another man held up a tablet and played a video from the party. A woman in a dark coat, short and thin, bending over the drink station. The face was unclear, but the silhouette could have been Claire's. Claire stared at the screen. She had been near that area the night before, scavenging for food in the trash after the guests left. She knew she had done nothing wrong, but she also knew that in James DeLuca's world, truth mattered less than his conviction. "I am not the woman in the video," she said, her voice shaking but her gaze hard. "I know nothing about any poisoning. I didn't even go into the party." He sat silent for a long moment, then calmly took out his phone and made a call. After a while, he returned and sat down opposite her. "The doctors say they have not identified the toxin. They gave the girl 12 hours before her heart stops. If you have anything to say, now is the time." Claire looked into the man's eyes, and in that strange instant, she did not just see a bloodless mob boss. She saw a father driven to desperation. She took a deep breath. 4 years ago, I saw a boy die from a poison with symptoms very similar to this. I'm not certain, but if you let me see your daughter's medical records, I may know what we're dealing with." A tense silence fell over the room. Then James DeLuca looked up. He said nothing, only regarded her for a long time as if reassessing his whole worldview. In that moment, Claire understood that her life and the life of the little girl named Emily had been placed on the same scale. If your chest tightens at the thought of Claire meeting James DeLuca's steel-cold gaze, if you want to know whether a homeless woman who has lost everything can truly save the daughter of New York's most feared crime boss, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, hit like, and share this video to follow every twist of this breathless story. And where are you watching from? Some bustling street? A A small room at midnight, or some place that makes your spine feel a shiver like Claire's in that concrete room. Leave a comment to tell me where you're listening from so I can know which corners of the world this story has reached and how many hearts it has touched. Thank you for staying with us at the moment Claire escaped death by the skin of her teeth. Keep following because from here, the journey to save Emily has only just begun, and the price to be paid will not be small. James DeLuca rose, dabbed a handkerchief at the corner of his eye, but his gaze remained like cold steel. No one dared speak in the room. Even the burly men standing guard were perfectly still. Claire was still tied to the chair, her wrists raw from the tight bindings, but she did not take her eyes off the man deciding her fate. She had nothing left to lose, and that made her fearless. James walked slowly to a metal table in the center of the room, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm on the surface as if he were weighing a sentence. When he spoke, his voice was unchanged, deep and eerily calm. You have 5 minutes to convince me you are not the one who poisoned my daughter. After that, I make no promises of mercy. Claire tried to sit up straighter. Her voice was hoarse after nearly an hour of being dragged, locked up, and unofficially interrogated. I was a nurse. I worked in the emergency department at St. Joseph's for almost 8 years. I know the signs of neurotoxic poisoning. What you described about your daughter I have seen before. Not just once, but in a single case. A 12-year-old boy named Marcus. He had seizures after eating a strange candy at the playground. No injection marks, no bruises. When the toxicology came back, everything was negative. We couldn't identify the toxin and we couldn't save him. He died within 22 hours. His heart stopped after losing control of movement and breathing. James looked up, his eyes darkening. He signaled to a man by the door who immediately called the physicians monitoring Emily. Minutes later, there was a knock, and a doctor in a white coat was brought in. He set down an electronic chart on the table, his hands trembling as he faced James. "Read it," James ordered. The doctor nodded and flipped the record open. Female patient, 10 years old. Symptoms began after drinking a glass of juice at a charity event. Time from exposure to symptom onset approximately 30 minutes. Symptoms include blurred vision, dizziness, tremors, inability to stand, progressive respiratory failure, depressed reflexes, no signs of bacterial or viral infection. Routine toxicology screens all negative. We suspect a synthetic toxin not yet recorded in the database. James looked up at Claire in silence for a long beat. "Continue," he said. Claire swallowed, her eyes beginning to shine with the faint hope that James was listening. "I don't have access to a lab or diagnostics right now, but if I were allowed to see the detailed record, to know exactly what the girl's condition is, I could compare it to the notes I kept after Marcus died. I recorded every symptom, the responses to medications, and the failed treatments." James cut her off. "You say you were a nurse. Then why are you on the street now, begging for food?" Claire lifted her eyes without flinching. "Because I broke the hospital's rules. When I learned the only antidote that might have saved Marcus wasn't covered by insurance and the hospital refused to buy it, I took the medicine from the supply and administered it myself. But I was too late. He died on the operating table. I was fired and lost my license. No one would hire me. Since then, I've lived on the street, surviving on what is left of my conscience." James stared at her without speaking, as if measuring every breath she took. Claire did not avoid that gaze. She did not beg for pity. She spoke with the full heart of someone who had watched a child die and had been powerless to do anything. "If you are telling the truth, if you witnessed this toxin, then you hold the only chance to save Emily. But if you lie, you will not only kill her, you will insult my intelligence, and I will not forgive that." "I am not lying," Claire said softly. "No one believed me 3 years ago. I do not expect you to believe me now. I only ask for a chance to do what is right." James stepped very close. Claire could feel his breath, heavy with whiskey and power. He leaned in and whispered, "I trust no one, but I trust my instincts. My instinct says you may know something the top medical team does not, so you will have a chance. But if you make me waste my time, I will do what the medical system and the courts could not. I will end you in the blink of an eye." He signaled, and the guard loosened her bindings. Claire rose, trembling from the cold and from what had just occurred. She had survived an interrogation by a devil, and perhaps, for the first time in 3 years, she would have the chance to do something meaningful not for herself, but for a dying child she had never met. Claire was released from the cold metal chair, but her legs remained numb after hours of immobility. She rose with difficulty, the torn shoulder of her coat revealing a faded t-shirt beneath. James DeLuca stood with his arms folded, leaning against the table, his gaze following her every step, alert yet unmistakably intrigued, as though this woman homeless, nameless, powerless had just crawled out of the mouth of death with eyes full of resolve. Claire steadied herself, adjusted her coat, and faced James. Her voice was low and eerily calm as she said that if she helped him save his daughter, she would need one condition. The room fell silent. The men in black glanced at one another, and then at James, as if no one had ever dared bargain with him before. James showed no change in expression and said, "Go on." Claire drew a long breath and asked him to withdraw entirely all the financial extortions, protection payments, and legal obstructions directed at St. Joseph's Hospital, to leave them alone forever. A soft tap of shoes sounded as James circled her like a predator appraising prey and asked why that hospital. Claire did not flinch in her gaze and explained that 3 years earlier, Marcus Chan, a 12-year-old boy who had been poisoned, had been brought to St. Joseph's. He was the son of an immigrant mechanic with no insurance, and the only antidote was prohibitively expensive, forcing the hospital to choose between financial constraints and making an exception to save a life. They could not save him, but the true reason was not money alone, but the pressure created by debts James himself had imposed, debts that had forced St. Joseph's to close a pediatric wing for lack of funds, and she knew this because she had been there. James paused, a cold flash in his eyes, and demanded whether she wanted him to sacrifice his own interest and cut off a steady income stream just for the chance to save his daughter. Claire answered that it was not merely a chance but the only hope. If she was right, she was the only person who had ever seen this toxin and could find a way to save the child, but she would not act unless he ended the vicious cycle that had led children like Marcus to die. James regarded her for a long time in silence, as the wind through the window made the light flicker and their shadows stretch over the gray concrete, and Claire continued that she did not need money or a home. She only needed him to remove the hands that were strangling a place that had once saved thousands of innocent lives. If he truly wanted to save his daughter, he should understand the price of a life. James was silent, then turned away, took out his phone, and dialed. His voice over the line was as cold as ever, as he ordered his people in finance to stop all collections from St. Joseph's, cancel all debts, free them to operate without interference, no hesitation, no negotiation. When he hung up, he looked back at Claire and said he had done something he had never done for anyone, and now it was her turn. She had 18 hours, and if Emily did not live, his promise would die with her, and he would show no more mercy. Claire nodded and said she did not need the whole 18 hours. She needed full access to medical records, an honest medical team, a quiet place to work, and, if possible, to locate people involved in Marcus's case who might remember something. James nodded to a guard. "Mason," he said, "give her everything she needs, and if she lies, you know what to do." Claire turned and followed Mason out of the stifling room. The door closed behind them, and for the first time in 3 years, living at society's bottom, a small flame began to glow in her chest. Not fear or pain, but an old fire that had lived in her when she once wore a white coat, the will to save a life. This time, she thought, she was not only saving a child, she was saving herself. The hallway leading from the interrogation room down to the basement treatment wing was cold and long, stretching out like a tunnel with no exit. Mason walked ahead, tall and broad-shouldered, silent as stone. Claire followed, her eyes sweeping every corner as if imprinting each detail, each turn into memory. She had no idea whether she would ever leave this place alive, but she knew one thing with absolute clarity. Time was slipping backward against Emily's heartbeat. Below, an emergency treatment ward had been built as if this were an underground hospital. Advanced machines hummed softly, nurses moved with quick precision, and no one raised their voice. When Claire entered, several heads lifted for a few seconds before returning to their work. Mason introduced her to the lead physician, Dr. Evelyn Park, a Korean-American woman in her early 50s with neatly tied hair and piercing eyes. "She'll lead the research team," Mason said. "James has ordered it." Claire nodded to Evelyn, then immediately requested copies of all medical files, every blood and urine test, every vital sign from the moment Emily's symptoms appeared until now. While waiting for the data to load onto the computer, she looked through a one-way glass panel, where Emily lay motionless on a bed, her small body swallowed by a white patient gown, her face pale like melting wax. A slow IV drip released one fragile drop at a time, the remnants of the child's dwindling life. Claire did not look away. The image overlapped with Marcus from 3 years earlier, the same half-closed eyes, the same cold white bed, the same crushing helplessness tightening inside her chest. 3 years ago, Claire had been an exceptional nurse in the emergency department at St. Joseph's Hospital. She had been the first to take in Marcus Chan, the 12-year-old boy brought in unconscious after a mysterious seizure. She and her team had done everything possible, drawing labs, administering fluids, giving neurological support medications, even recommending transfer to another facility. But time outran every effort. When they realized Marcus might have been exposed to an unidentified neurotoxin, the only hope was an antidote not yet approved by the Food and Drug Administration and not covered by insurance. The hospital, already strangled by budget cuts and financial pressure from underground organizations, refused to purchase it. Claire had refused to accept that. She had gone into the pharmaceutical supply room, signed out the antidote under the attending physician's code, and injected it into Marcus as a last attempt. But Marcus did not survive. Her actions had been caught on camera. She was fired, stripped of her license, sued for violating medical protocol. No hospital would hire her again. She had left her apartment, sold what she could, and eventually faded into the streets of New York like a wandering shadow. Now, standing before Emily, Claire was neither a nurse nor a disgraced offender. She was the only hope left. The computer chimed, the data was ready. Claire sat down, her eyes scanning line after line of information. Abnormal dopamine levels, disrupted neurotransmission, weakening muscles, escalating respiratory distress, everything like a faint carbon copy of the Marcus file she still held in her mind. She pulled out her old phone, opened the worn photos of handwritten notes, and compared each number. She turned to Evelyn. "I believe this is the same toxin or a very close variant. But I can't be certain until we identify its components. Someone may have manufactured this." Evelyn nodded. "I'll have the team access international databases." Mason approached and handed Claire a document. "This is the agreement. James wants everything clear. You save Emily, and he fulfills the condition you asked for." Claire took the file and flipped open the first page. Inside were detailed terms, along with a signature from James's personal attorney. And on the final page, James DeLuca's own signature, the ink still fresh. She picked up the pen and signed Claire Whitmore, her hand trembling but her stroke steady. When the last line dried, the contract was sealed not between two ordinary people, but between someone cast out by the system and someone who ruled the shadows. A contract of life and death, one both understood would never see a second chance. Claire rose, drawing a deep breath. She looked at Emily one more time. "Let's begin. I want access to all toxicology data the city has collected over the past 5 years. If someone created this toxin, I will find him. And this time, I won't let another child die." While Claire began sifting through toxicological data and working alongside Dr. Evelyn Park to narrow down the rare neurochemical compounds capable of causing symptoms like Emily's, on another floor of the same building, James DeLuca was convening a closed-door meeting with his most trusted investigators and scouts. The meeting room lay in a soundproofed sublevel, its soft amber lighting reflecting off the severe faces gathered around a long wooden table. James stood at the head, a large map of New York City spread before him, several hotspots already marked in red. Mason stood beside him, a tablet in hand displaying the profiles of potential suspects. James wasted no time. He tapped a finger lightly against the map, his gaze sweeping over the loyal men before him. "We have 18 hours, he began. "If the toxin is what Claire says it is, the person who created it is no ordinary civilian. This is a high-grade synthetic compound, almost certainly from an illegal lab. The man behind it must be someone with deep knowledge of toxicology, neurochemistry, and access to the underground market." He paused. "His name is the Alchemist, a ghost in our world. He belongs to no gang, yet has sold poisons to both sides. He vanished 3 years ago after poisoning a congressman in Chicago. Never caught. Never found. But I don't believe he disappeared. No one creates something like this and sits quietly afterward." Nolan, the youngest scout in the group, spoke softly. "There are rumors he once hid in the old factories along the river in Brooklyn, near the abandoned port." Mason nodded. "I've heard of that area. It's outside our jurisdiction now. It's in the hands of Vincent Moreau." The room shifted, the air sinking heavy. That name meant something to all of them. Vincent Moreau, the head of the French-speaking East End faction, was known for brutality and treachery, once an ally of James until a failed weapons deal severed all ties. If the alchemist was hiding in his territory, reaching him would be far from easy. James stood silent for several seconds, then nodded. Send a message to Moreau. Tell him I want the man, not a war. But if he chooses poorly, I will turn Brooklyn to ash. Mason stepped out to send encrypted codes to their contacts across the borough. Meanwhile, James turned back to the rest of the team. I want surveillance footage around the port reviewed for the last 12 hours. Use thermal scans if you have to. Compile every abandoned lab within a 3-mile radius. Track all chemical purchases, especially anything involving organophosphate compounds. Nolan, you handle data routes. Alex, monitor the underground medical networks. Anyone buying antitoxins in the last 6 months, flag it. If the alchemist is working for Moreau, there will be signs. On the upper floor, Claire was beginning to align protein chains from Emily's blood samples with reaction patterns from Marcus's case. But time offered her no mercy. Emily's heart activity had begun showing signs of severe arrhythmia. They would need a treatment plan within the next 12 hours before her organs began shutting down one by one. James knew it. He glanced at his watch, each passing second echoing like one more fading heartbeat of his daughter, yet his expression never wavered. For him, this was no longer a mission. It was the only life-or-death campaign of his existence, and failure was not an option. James pulled out his phone, dialing a contact in Montreal. His voice was low and uncompromising. I need the latest intel on the alchemist, whatever it costs. 15 minutes later, the call returned. A man around 55, real name Anton Varga, once worked for a research institute in Budapest before disappearing after a chemical scandal. He was believed to have entered the United States illegally through Canada 3 years ago. The latest whisper placed him near the Brooklyn docks under the alias Eric Lang. James ended the call, turned to Mason and said, "Prepare the team. We move in 30 minutes." If Claire was racing against death, then so were they. And James swore to himself, with a quiet fury smoldering behind his calm gaze, that he would not let his daughter die because some ghost decided to hide in the dark. By 7 in the evening, the temperature outside had dropped below freezing, and fog from the Hudson drifted in thick sheets, draping over the damp Brooklyn streets like a heavy, breathing curtain. Inside James DeLuca's temporary command post, hurried footsteps and clipped orders echoed through the hallways. The strike team was ready, each man clad in lightweight body armor, lightly armed, earpieces in place, eyes fixed on the glowing map of the abandoned port where the alchemist might be hiding. James stood in the center of the operations room, his gaze locked on the highlighted zones, his shoulders pulled tight like drawn wire, his mind consumed by a single thought. With every passing second, Emily's small heart was beating weaker. When Mason returned with the list of possible entry points and the shortest routes into the derelict factory district, James spoke without hesitation. "Call Claire down. She's coming with us." Claire had just returned from the lab, her eyes bloodshot after hours of combing through data without blinking. She still could not identify the exact compound eating away at Emily's nervous system, but the deeper she dug into the biochemical reactions, the more convinced she became that only the creator of the toxin knew the antidote. When she received word that she was to join the raid, she froze for a moment. Her face was pale with exhaustion, but her gaze held firm. She carried no weapon, wore no armor, only a long coat and an old pair of worn shoes. Mason looked her up and down. "You're sure you want to go? Where we're heading isn't safe." Claire nodded. "If I'm the only one who's seen these symptoms before, I might be the only one who can recognize him when we find him. And if we bring back the wrong man, Emily won't have time for a second chance." Mason didn't argue. He simply handed her an earpiece and a phone loaded with the internal mapping system. James stepped forward, meeting her eyes. "This isn't a hospital. You can't give orders out there. But if you recognize anything connected to the toxin, speak immediately. No hesitation." Claire nodded. "Understood." 3 black SUVs sped into the night, cutting across cracked streets toward East Brooklyn. No one inside spoke. Only breathing and the flash of streetlights sliding across the windows broke the silence. Claire sat between Mason and a gunman named Alex, gripping the phone displaying her data. She kept scanning through her old notes on Marcus, searching for the smallest overlap that might help identify the alchemist. All she had was a blurred portrait of a man who had once been a legitimate researcher before vanishing from the world as if erased. But Claire knew people like that didn't disappear, they simply slipped into the shadows, where no one questioned them and no one held them accountable. As they neared the abandoned port, The city lights faded behind them, replaced by crumbling concrete structures, rusting containers, and overgrown paths strangled by weeds. The convoy killed their headlights and crept forward until stopping about 300 meters from the target. Mason motioned for silence. The team split into small units, approaching from two directions. Claire stayed close to Mason, her steps slow but steady. What she carried wasn't a weapon but memory, instinct, and 3 years of torment from a failure she had never forgiven herself for. She could feel the air here thicker than the city's, thick like the invisible toxin pulsing through Emily's veins. Claire looked up at the broken warehouse windows where a faint yellow light glowed from deep inside. A sound rustled ahead, a shadow flitting past as quickly as a breath. Mason tightened his grip on his gun, but Claire suddenly whispered, "Wait." She pointed to a half-fallen billboard, and beneath it, a faded chemical symbol smeared by time yet unmistakable to her. It was a variant notation of the neurotoxin compound she'd seen in Marcus's records. No one but the alchemist used that kind of notation. Claire turned to Mason, her voice barely a breath. "He's here. It's him. And if we don't go in now, he'll disappear again. And this time, no one will be lucky enough to find him a second time." Mason immediately signaled the team to halt, then turned to Claire with a look sterner than before. "Are you sure? We have only one chance." Claire nodded without hesitation, her eyes fixed on the chemical marking scrawled in gray paint over the billboard, the old white chalk lines still faintly etched beneath exactly the molecular notation that had appeared in Marcus's blood analysis and now in Emily's serum. No one but the maker of that toxin knew that structure. The alchemist was here, and they had to move before he could erase the trace, but the main entrance to the warehouse had been sealed with steel and wired to alarms. James, over the radio, asked for a quick status. Claire summarized everything crisply and clearly. A few seconds of silence. Then James's voice cut through, calm and decisive. "Find another way. Slip in. Do not engage him until you are certain he is the one. If he is, bring him back alive at all costs." Mason called Nolan forward. The young scout had been poring over old infrastructure maps on his tablet, and within 2 minutes, located a storm drain that ran from the old seawall straight into the rear ground floor of the warehouse, an abandoned rain channel from the 80s narrow enough for a person to crawl through if they kept low. The team moved to the edge of the seawall where the drain mouth was hidden beneath a pile of rusted barrels and choking vines. Claire stooped and for the first time in years, felt her heartbeat pound in her chest, not from fear but from a strange, familiar rush she used to feel when entering a life-or-death ER case. One by one they slipped into the drain, flashlight beams dulled to avoid detection. The air inside was damp, thick with the smell of metal, mud, and something old and rotten. Claire moved between Mason and Alex, her hand trailing along the damp concrete, her feet splashing through cold water up to her ankles as they crept through narrow turns. The drip of water echoed under the arches like an underground metronome. Claire fought to steady her breathing while images raced through her mind, Marcus's eyes before they closed forever, Emily's pallid face through the ward glass, the data she had yet to analyze, and the name Anton Varga taking on real flesh. Once a leading chemist in neurotransmitter research, expelled by the scientific community for a dark past, vanished from Europe and resurfacing in America as a stateless poison merchant, and now possibly right ahead of them. At the end of the drain they found an iron grate blocking the ascent. Alex used a spark-free cutter and within minutes cleared a space just large enough to crawl through. Above lay a derelict auxiliary room, with a stair leading up to the warehouse's main corridor. Mason went first, sweeping the area, then signaled safe. The team crawled out, mud-smeared, and sweating dust from old bricks. Claire looked up at the high ceiling veiled in cobwebs and the faint glow of a distant incandescent bulb and breathed in deeply, before whispering to Mason that they were in the right place. There could be no mistake. The chemical tang in the air, the soundproofed walls, the double door design. This was no mere hideout, but an underground laboratory. Something thudded in her chest when she noticed the walls lined with lead to block signals and heat, the kind of precaution only top-tier toxin research facilities used. At that moment, a metallic clatter and the sound of running feet came from above. Someone had been alerted. James ordered through the radio, Team 1 hold position, Team 2 approach from the north. No gunfire without orders. Claire hugged the wall, fingers clenched around the strap of her medical pack, where she had concealed an emergency syringe and a handheld biochemistry meter. Her gaze was as sharp as a blade. She knew that behind that layer of wall sat the only person who could save Emily, and perhaps the only person who had once taken Marcus's life. The confrontation had begun not with bullets but with knowledge, instinct, and truth, and Claire prayed silently that she would not be wrong, because Emily could not endure another second. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed along the corridor above, and the whole team shifted formation in an instant. Mason signaled for Claire and Alex to melt into the shadowed corner behind a rusted door that had just opened from the storm drain, while Nolan and 3 others moved the opposite way to lock down any northern escape routes. And in less than 30 seconds, the entire warehouse lay encircled by a silent tactical ring. No shots fired, only the heavy hush of prepared men. Claire pressed herself against the cold brick, her heart pounding as the footsteps drew closer, and 2 thin, quick-moving men in long coats appeared at the far end of the hall, hyper-alert and light on their feet, one wearing protective goggles and clutching a silenced pistol, both with comms wired to their ears, murmuring in a hybrid of French and Eastern European, and Claire caught fragments about unstable reaction samples and leave in 20 minutes, which told Mason with a glance that these were his men and that their master was preparing to flee. Mason gave the hand signal and, in a single practiced movement, the strike team erupted like a storm, the 2 men unable to draw weapons as they were forced down onto the rough concrete floor, and a struggle sounded through the thick walls. One of them twisted and flailed until Alex slammed his arm and snapped it behind his back with a bone. Rattling crack. Claire stepped forward and stared at the goggled man, noting a long scar trailing from neck to shoulder, and a look in his eyes that she recognized from those who had worked too long in lightless, amoral places, and she bent low and spoke with a flat certainty. "Where is Anton Varga?" The man pressed his lips shut. Claire leaned closer and said that she was the only one who could keep him alive, that if his poison killed James DeLuca's daughter, then Anton would not survive the night either. The captive's gaze faltered, and, after a heartbeat of hesitation, he muttered the location, the main room on the 3rd floor, behind the reaction chamber, an access hatch hidden behind the shelving, and that no one was to approach him. Mason signaled the ascent, and they climbed the squeaking iron stairs, each step a protest. Claire at the rear feeling as if the blood in her veins were being squeezed. She knew time was draining away. On the 3rd floor, a dark corridor lit by a few dim bulbs led them by hand, drawn markers on the wall to a sealed steel door. Mason tried the handle, then nodded to Nolan to place a remote charge, and a single dull blast popped the hinges loose, the door yawning open onto a soundproofed chamber where lab benches were cluttered with test tubes, chemicals, blueprints, and in the center an unsteady man with salt and pepper hair and an ink-stained lab coat was hastily gathering papers. Anton Varga turned, his eyes wide with disbelief, a small syringe filled with a greenish solution gleaming under the light in his hand. Claire stepped into the room with empty hands and announced her name, Claire Whitmore, telling him she had not come to kill, but to ask about Marcus and to save a little girl suffering from the very poison he had made. And Anton gripped the syringe, panic shining in his eyes, insisting that no one could save her without the antidote he alone could reproduce, that nobody else understood it. Claire walked slowly toward him, her voice steady and low as she said she had watched a child die from that toxin and had lived on with the burden, that she had tracked him for 3 years, not for revenge but for answers, and asked him, if he had any humanity left, to let her try to save the child. Anton studied her, then lowered his hand and agreed, but on condition that he go with them. He needed equipment and a sterile environment to recreate the antidote. It could not be moved. It had to be remade on site. Mason stepped forward, binding Anton's hands gently but firmly, and signaled the team to withdraw via the underground route. Claire stayed close to Anton, her eyes never leaving the single syringe that now carried Emily's last hope. And as they descended the cold steps, she understood that the fight was far from over. But for the first time a shape had formed out of the dark, hope walking beside her, carrying the final chance to hold on to a life that was slipping away by the minute. The convoy returned to the compound through a night as sharp as a blade, rolling silently past empty streets where the weak glow of street lamps washed over faces, drawn tight with fatigue and tension. Inside the car, Claire sat pressed beside Anton Varga, her eyes fixed on the small metal case holding the single syringe he had carried with him. His hands trembled faintly, yet his gaze remained cold and exacting, the stare of a scientist who believed he still controlled the reactions unfolding around him. Mason sat opposite, one hand resting on the grip of his gun, ready for any sudden move. When the vehicles stopped before the temporary treatment wing, nurses and technicians were already waiting. "Doctor," Evelyn Park led the way herself, preparing the most secure, sterile, silent room available, one hastily outfitted to mimic a microbiological laboratory. Claire and Evelyn removed their old protective gear, washed their hands in antiseptic, and slipped into fresh lab coats. Anton's restraints were removed only after a full body scan confirmed he carried no weapons or hidden toxins. He looked around the room and nodded, as if he had finally stepped back onto the terrain where he belonged. I need a bioreaction microscope, a sample refrigerator, an isolated air filtration system, and the most recent blood parameters of the patient, he said. And genetic mapping, if possible. Evelyn signaled her team, and they hurried to assemble everything. Within 20 minutes, the room was fully equipped. Emily still lay in the isolation ward, her face ghost pale, lips cracked dry, her fragile heartbeat the only thread tying her to the world. Claire stood at the glass, her eyes locked on every flickering number on the monitors. There was not much time left. When she turned back, she saw Anton already analyzing Emily's blood sample, comparing it to the old data Claire had recorded from Marcus. He asked no questions, offered no explanation, he simply worked, in a silence so heavy it felt like a weight pressing against the walls. Claire watched every movement, every drop of reagent, every measured heating to break down protein reactions, while Evelyn stood beside them, cross-checking results with the main hospital network. The air felt so dense it swallowed sound, as though even the machines held their breath. One tiny error, 1 minute lost, could be the end. Then Anton spoke, his voice rough and steady. The toxin is a modified variant of neuroxin class X. I altered the structure to avoid all standard testing panels, but that alteration also made it unstable. It self-degrades after 36 hours. The window for survival is under 24. Beyond that, neurological damage cannot be reversed. Claire clenched her fists. We have less than 10 hours. Anton nodded. But there is one piece of good news. I preserved the neutralizing reaction within the protein model. If I can recreate it, the girl has a chance. Claire's voice barely rose above a whisper. How much of a chance? If the process holds 60%, if there are complications, below 30, but it remains the only chance she has. Evelyn looked at Claire and nodded once. We begin. You and I handle the secondary reactions. I'll monitor the instruments. You keep your eyes on the serum response. Claire stepped forward without hesitation, pulling on gloves and a mask, a current running along her spine as she stood beneath the sterile, white lights. For the first time in 3 years, she was exactly where she once belonged. No frantic footsteps in the hallway, no threats, no doubt-laden stares, only the steady hum of the air filter, the turning of test tubes, the tapping of keys, and a child's failing heart counting down the seconds. And in that cold room, Claire felt something rising inside her, not just the need to prove to James DeLuca that she had never lied, but the chance to reclaim the part of herself buried beneath the ruins of her past. If the antidote worked, she would not only save Emily, she would save the woman she used to be. The emergency lab lights cast long, wavering shadows across the 3 figures, working relentlessly, their eyes fixed on every smallest reaction unfolding inside the glass tubes. Claire stood at the center, her hands rigid as she held the separation vial steady, while the solution slowly shifted color. To her right, Dr. Evelyn Park checked the temperature of each step with clinical precision. To her left, Anton Varga tapped rapidly across his tablet, adjusting the ratios of the newly synthesized enzymes. No one spoke during the first 15 minutes. The only sounds were the soft pulses of the biochemical monitor and the faint clink of glass against glass in a rhythm that allowed no room for hesitation. Every movement had to be exact, every milliliter, every degree, every second. Even a slight misstep could destroy the entire antidote sample before they reached the protein reconstruction phase. Claire bit down hard when she noticed the enzymatic reaction slowing. She drew a long breath, adjusted the stirring speed, and whispered to Evelyn, "Lower the temperature by 3 degrees. Hold it for 7 minutes, then raise it back." Evelyn nodded, her hands moving so swiftly they appeared like shadows. Anton watched everything through the glowing interface of his touchscreen, sweat gathering along his hairline. Each time he pressed confirm, it felt as though he pushed himself closer to a precipice, where old guilt and the consequences of years spent hidden in the dark were waiting to swallow him. Claire glanced at him and spoke softly for the first time. "If you're unsure about anything, say it now. We don't have time for experiments." Anton's voice, low and hoarse, carried an unexpected steadiness. I've never recreated this antidote under conditions this crude, but if you hold the rhythm like that, it may work. We're on the right track. In Claire's mind, numbers ticked down like a silent clock. Emily had been poisoned for more than 13 hours. Every passing minute allowed irreversible neural damage to spread. She returned her focus to the vial, carefully dripping a new reagent into the protein model. The liquid instantly shifted from clear to pale yellow, then slowly to a soft blue exactly as it should. Claire exhaled, a quiet sigh of relief. Another step successful. But the next one would be the real test. If the activation enzyme failed to bind perfectly to the toxin structure, everything would collapse. Evelyn murmured, "Reaction chamber pressure is stable. Begin reconstruction." Claire inhaled, her fingers trembling slightly as she lifted the vial and carried it to the magnetic mixer. She set it in the center, pressed the start button, and closed her eyes for a single heartbeat, as though sending a prayer into the whirring darkness. When the motor began to turn, the proteins inside the tube started to knit themselves together again. Each rotation was a test for life itself. Anton stared at the analysis panels, his voice sinking into something close to confession. "I once thought this compound would be used only once for one target. I never imagined it would return." Claire kept her gaze on the machine, whispering, "But it came back. And this time, we're using it to save someone." 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The room was reduced to the steady hum of the motor and the sound of Claire's heartbeat pounding in her chest. Evelyn counted down. 50 seconds. 40. 30. Claire leaned close, tension tightening her entire face. 20. 10. When the machine finally stopped, all three stepped forward together, watching the antidote, now a clear, luminous shade of jade, glow in the vial. Anton nodded, his lips moving without forming words. "You've done it." Claire carefully lifted the vial from the mixer, placed it inside the sterile case, and turned to Evelyn. "Check the reaction once more before we inject it." Evelyn worked in silence, and a few minutes later she confirmed, "No precipitates. Structure stable. We can administer it." Claire clutched the case to her chest and hurried out of the lab. Down the hallway, she heard James DeLuca speaking with the attending physician, his voice lower than she had ever heard it. "If her heart stops, do everything. Don't wait for me." Claire stepped forward, offering the vial to the doctor. "This is her last hope. She only needs to hold on for 10 more minutes." James turned toward her, and for the first time, his eyes held no threat. He nodded slowly, as though entrusting the most precious thing he had to a woman he once doubted. Claire said nothing. She simply looked through the glass wall where Emily fought for every brittle breath, and she knew that in just a few minutes, they would learn whether life would return or slip quietly away. When the syringe carrying the antidote was threaded into Emily's vein, everyone in the isolation room and the corridor outside seemed to hold their breath. Claire stood a step from the glass, her hands clenched white at her sides, eyes locked on the small, motionless face on the bed, the heart still arrhythmic, the monitors blinking with anxious insistence, and time itself appeared to stop. Just as hope began to stir that a miracle might occur, a massive explosion shook the ground floor and the whole building trembled. The corridor lights flickered and then switched to emergency power while alarms wailed everywhere. Mason snapped up his weapon and sprinted for the stairwell with 3 members of the rapid response team on his heels. James barked into his radio, his voice cold. "Seal every entrance now. Get Claire and Anton into the safe room. Evelyn, protect the lab at all costs." A nurse came running, pale as paper, saying there was a truck rammed straight into the ambulance bay, fully armed, and they appeared to know the layout. Before Claire could react, she was pulled toward the left corridor into a reinforced storage room made like a medical bunker. Anton followed close behind, and Mason shouted that they must not let the attackers near Emily. If the antidote worked, the girl had to live. Inside the safe room, Claire heard gunfire downstairs, a staccato of rounds punching through concrete as if to underline the ugly truth. These intruders had not come to threaten, they had come to kill. James stood like a frozen sentinel before the control room door, his suppressed pistol gripped in both hands, his eyes like ice. The moment they traced Anton's signature, Casaro had surely traced it too. Casaro was the one underworld figure who had openly challenged James on both money and principle, and he did not merely want Anton dead to cut loose a thread, he wanted to humiliate James at his most vulnerable point, at the center of his heart, the daughter lying there, waiting to be brought back second by second. Casaro's force was not large, but it was disciplined, clothed in black armor and moving in formation. One team infiltrated from the old warehouse at the back where sensors were sparse. Another crashed through the ambulance entrance using a truck as cover and a smoke screen. James shouted orders into the radio. Alex, hold the west corridor. Nolan, flank up to the second floor. Priority 1, protect Emily. Priority 2, prevent any man from laying a hand on Claire or Anton. In the safe room, Claire trembled in waves, not from fear but from fury. She could not accept, after everything and precisely as Emily had a chance to live, that men would risk everything to silence some filthy past. Anton pressed his ear to the wall to hear the gunfire, breathing hard, then turned to Claire. If they break in here, she must destroy the sample. I cannot let Casero have it, he said. Claire nodded, but her eyes were drawn to the surveillance feeds, where she could see Mason grappling with 2 masked intruders on the turn of the third-floor stair. Blood stained one side of his jacket, but he still held his ground. Another explosion rocked the corridor, this time near the storage by the lab. Smoke rose and the camera feed there died. Evelyn cried over the radio that they were trying to set the lab on fire and demanded immediate reinforcements. James answered at once. Hold your position. I'm coming. Claire tightened the earpiece in her ear. Tears sliding down her cheeks she did not notice, feeling the whole building rising up against time, against flame, and against the people who had made a livelihood from causing death. And amid all that chaos there lay a little girl in a room, the antidote in her body for not yet 10 minutes. Claire prayed silently, not for herself but for Emily, for James, for those who had taken their bodies as shields to protect this final chance at life. Outside the gunfire continued and smoke filled every nook, but here, inside the sealed, tense room, Claire gripped her own cold hand and whispered with absolute conviction, "She will live. We will not let her die. Not this time." While gunfire thundered in violent waves from the floor below, Claire and Anton had no choice inside the safe room but to keep recreating the antidote. The first injection had carried hope into Emily's body, yet Anton warned plainly that the initial dose merely slowed the destruction of her neural cells, and that at least 2 more doses were needed for the full molecular reaction to ignite and stabilize. Claire understood exactly what that meant. They had to keep working even though the world outside had collapsed into hell. Anton opened the kit he had salvaged from the field lab, spreading the last vials of solvent across the steel table, his hands trembling, but his eyes sharp with the precision of a man who had lived too long on the knife edge between life and death. Claire followed every instruction in silence, lips pressed tight, sweat slipping down her wrist, despite the cold that kept the medicine viable. Each explosion shook the ceiling and forced her to tighten her grip on her own mind, dragging it back from panic. Out there, people were fighting to keep her and a child she had never met alive, and in here, she fought to ensure that life meant something. Evelyn's voice crackled through the radio, hoarse with smoke. Part of the lab was burning. The auxiliary reaction sample had been destroyed, and if dose 2 was not completed, there would be no backup materials at all. Claire paused exactly 1 second, then shook her head, no stopping. Anton looked at her with a mixture of doubt and respect, and asked what she had once been. Claire murmured that she was someone who had witnessed too many deaths she could not prevent, and she would not let that happen again. A heavy crash tipped the room, lights flickered and steadied, and Mason shouted over the radio that the eastern wall had been breached. He was holding one corridor but needed 5 minutes. He demanded to know how much longer they needed. Claire checked the enzyme reaction and answered 11 minutes any faster, and the compound would destabilize. Any slower, and Emily would not survive. Anton nodded and bent over the heat array. Each digit he adjusted a matter of life and death, while Evelyn, coughing from smoke seeping through the cracked ventilation, coached them through cooling the remaining model to keep the protein from collapsing. Amid the chaos, Claire realized something strange. She was not afraid. Though bullets tore the building and fire crawled through its wiring, she felt a profound stillness, perhaps because, for the first time in years, she was doing what she had been born to do, unburdened by guilt or exile, no longer a homeless woman dragged from a sidewalk but a healer, a scientist, a human being holding a life steady with 2 shaking but unwavering hands. Outside, James had just taken down the last intruder on the 3rd-floor corridor when he heard that Mason had been wounded in the shoulder and was pinned near the 2nd-floor stairwell. He roared into the radio for nearby units to assist and to let no one reach the lab. At the same time, 2 members of Casero's crew began approaching the auxiliary tunnel, leading to the technical wing where Claire and Anton worked, the iron door rattling under their blows. Claire heard it, and her heart clenched. Anton whispered that their time was running out. Claire pulled a small syringe of the nearly finished compound from her bag and placed it into the emergency cold vault. If the attackers broke in, at least one chance would remain, though she knew that if they failed tonight, there would be no third attempt. The wall shook again. A shout cut the air, footsteps pounded, and Evelyn's voice rang through the radio saying she had locked the exterior door and the attackers were blocked. Keep going. Claire looked down at the final reaction, the pale blue glow stabilizing as the temperature held steady. She inhaled deeply, eyes burning yet bright with belief. Almost done, she whispered. Just one more minute. Outside, the guns kept roaring, but inside, a single drop of antidote slid into the glass tube, igniting a strange, luminous swirl, and in that fragile light, Claire knew hope was still breathing. The little girl still had a chance, and she herself, after everything, still had a reason to stand firm in the storm. When the final vial began shifting from its pale blue hue into that unmistakable shade of jade, Claire felt time slow to a crawl, as if each second stretched into its own fragile universe. Everything around her faded until only the sound of her heartbeat and her tight, uneven breaths remained, her hands still gripping the equipment, while her mind drifted somewhere far beyond, the smoke blurring the laboratory glass, a place where everything had begun, where Marcus was still alive, still smiling, still believing in her, with a faith no one else had ever offered. Through that swirling haze outside the lab window, she saw again the small room from years ago. Simple white walls, a worn leather chair, and Marcus's warm hand resting on her shoulder whenever she collapsed in exhaustion over towering stacks of medical files. He never forced her to be strong. He only reminded her that steadiness was the only choice when someone's life was held in your hands. His voice rose in her memory, gentle, familiar, like an old song she had never been able to forget, telling her she had not been born to run, but to face things head-on. The day Marcus died, something inside her shattered, who had stood beside her in every grueling year of her early career, but because he had been the only one who saw the last good part of her beneath all her mistakes, her failures, and the millions when she had wanted to give up. He had pulled her back from the edge of despair, held her through the cold rain of that first failed surgery, wiped her tears without ever once asking her to justify them, and when he died from a toxin they could not identify, she had not only lost him but lost her faith in herself. She abandoned the profession, left the city, let everything unfinished fall behind as if she had never existed in the world of science at all. But now, standing in a room thick with chemical fumes and sweat, holding in her hands the fragile hope of a small life fighting minute by minute, she understood Marcus was still here, not in flesh, but in the faith he had planted inside her, in the memory of his eyes when she pushed beyond her limits, in the belief he carried that someone capable of saving a life could never be a failure. Claire drew a long breath, brushing away the tears she could no longer restrain, placed the completed antidote into the sterile tray, sealed it, and called Evelyn over the radio. Finished. Send the nurse now. Anton braced a trembling hand on the table beside her, his eyes blurred, saying nothing as he looked at her with the stunned reverence of someone who had walked through years of darkness and was suddenly staring at the first light he had seen in so long. Claire spoke no further. She stepped out just as James came running toward her, his face streaked with dust and blood, his eyes raking over her to ensure she was unharmed. "Where is she?" he rasped. Claire lifted the tray, preparing for the second dose. If the reaction unfolds as the theory predicts, the girl could recover within 24 hours. James said nothing. He only gripped her shoulder, a fierce, grateful pressure that made something inside her melt. "Thank you," he breathed. Claire shook her head softly. "Don't thank me. Thank Marcus. If not for him, I wouldn't be standing here today." James froze for a brief, silent moment, then nodded, his eyes flickering, as if he understood the deeper thread, tying all of this together, a convergence of loss and life, of mistakes and redemption, of a man who had died and a child being pulled back from the brink. Claire turned toward the dim light of the treatment room where Emily still lay motionless, and in her heart she heard a voice rising clear and close, as though whispered right beside her ear. "You did the right thing, Claire. Now keep going. For her, and for yourself." Claire left the laboratory with the tray containing the second antidote dose locked inside the chilled case, her steps quick yet steady along the smoke-streaked hallway, still dusted with plaster from the assault. And although chaos continued outside, nurses rushing stretchers past her, the tactical team sweeping every corner for stragglers, The isolation room where Emily lay remained lit and silent, a small, fragile nucleus at the center of a storm. When Claire reached it, James was already there, staring through the thick glass, his face stripped of the ruthless resolve of a crime lord and replaced with the raw, aching helplessness of a father watching his child fade by degrees. Evelyn turned to Claire, her voice low and grave, saying Emily's heart rhythm was unstable, her reflexes slipping, and if the antidote was not administered within 15 minutes, her brain could suffer irreversible damage. Claire did not hesitate. She drew the vial, checked it once more, and handed it to the lead physician before stepping toward the glass, her eyes locking on the small body lying amid IV lines, monitors, and a cascade of survival numbers dropping like stones. Emily's face had gone pale, her lips turning blue, her chest rising in shallow, fragile waves, as though any second it might simply stop. James clenched his fists, his jaw tightening until the muscles stood out like cords. Never in his life had he felt so powerless. He had faced police, governments, entire syndicates, to protect what he believed in. But now he could do nothing except watch his daughter fight in silence, never once crying out. Claire touched his arm gently and murmured that the girl's body was reacting, that the slowing heart rate was not collapse but recalibration, the dangerous window in which the brain essentially relearned itself. If she survived the next 5 minutes, she would have a chance. James looked at her with terror and doubt, asking what if she didn't, and Claire could not answer. Inside the room, the doctor finished the injection, and the antidote traveled from Emily's tiny arm into her bloodstream, triggering the biochemical cascade Claire and Anton had built from that delicate enzyme response. The monitors spiked wildly, her heartbeat soaring then plunging, her oxygen dropping to a critical low before rebounding. Evelyn signaled for the crash cart and spare oxygen, tension thickening the air until no one dared breathe. Claire closed her eyes for a heartbeat, gripping her mask until her fingertips went white, thinking not of data or protocols but of Marcus, of his eyes the first time she saved a life, because that night she had succeeded through belief, not textbooks, and tonight was no different. It would not be machines that saved Emily, but the sheer will of the people standing here, people who had lost too much and sacrificed too much to falter now. Suddenly the monitor shrieked, Emily's heart racing upward before seizing in a tremor. The doctor shouted she was beginning mild convulsions and called for a stabilizing dose. Hands flew, nurses trembled. The room surged into motion like an orchestra striking the final desperate notes of a life-or-death symphony. Claire held her breath. If the chemicals reacted in the wrong direction, Emily's brain would be damaged beyond rescue. 1 minute passed an eternity, then another. Slowly the heartbeat settled, falling into steadier rhythms. The oxygen climbed into a safe range. The warning lights stopped flashing red. Evelyn exhaled in a shaking whisper, eyes shining. The girl was stabilizing, not healed, but responding exactly as the model predicted. James gripped the glass, his eyes reddened, his shoulders trembling for the first time in front of anyone. Claire squeezed his hand and said softly that 1 dose remained, and if the girl absorbed it without complications in the next 3 hours, they would win. James nodded, unable to speak, turning back to his daughter, and in that moment, Claire understood they had reached the final threshold, no longer a battle between syndicates or enemies, no longer about vengeance or power, but a last stand between life and death, between a fragile sliver of hope and the abyss of despair. And as long as Emily was breathing, none of them would walk away. The steady pulse of the monitors in the isolation room echoed like invisible knocks, counting down the remaining seconds of hope. And Claire stood outside the thick glass, her eyes locked on every faint movement across Emily's face, where the once pallid skin now held the slightest blush, like a tender sprout pushing through hardened earth after a storm. The third antidote dose had been administered less than 5 minutes earlier, and all they could do now was wait. Evelyn whispered to the lead physician, her voice low but unable to hide its tension, saying the biological response was stabilizing better than expected. The heartbeat steady, the blood pressure no longer lurching, but the neurological signs were still unclear. James stood beside Claire with one hand pressed to the window frame, his gaze so deep it felt as if the world had stopped inside his eyes. Every breath Emily took was a battle he could not join, one he could only witness in aching silence, powerless after a lifetime spent fighting the world to protect what he loved, now forced to trust a fragile science he had never believed in. Claire said nothing, only rested a gentle hand on his wrist, a quiet gesture of shared weight. She, too, was being torn apart in silence. No one had taught her what to do in moments like these, and no medical textbook had ever described how the border between life and death could feel so still, so merciless. Anton sat slumped against the wall behind them, arms crossed over his chest, breathing heavily. He had poured every last bit of strength into completing the final dose, and now he looked like a living remnant of his own mistakes, offering no excuses, no pleas, only watching the little girl he had so nearly condemned to the scythe of death. Evelyn turned to Claire and murmured that they would know in about 15 minutes. If the girl's brain began responding to the medication, she might open her eyes, and if not, the result would be either permanent damage or the complete shutting down of her neural activity. Claire nodded, her throat dry, every minute stretching out like a lifetime as they all went still as statues, their eyes fixed on Emily. The monitor tones lengthened, drawn thin by the suffocating anticipation inside the stark white room devoid of sunlight. James whispered, almost to himself, that the girl loved the rain, that every time it poured she would run into the yard, arms open wide, spinning in circles as if joy were the only thing the world was made of. Claire looked at him. This man feared by the entire underworld was now nothing more than a father clinging to a fragile memory to keep himself from breaking. He was no longer a crime lord. He was simply a parent. Inside, the doctor leaned in to check Emily's pupils with a penlight. Claire held her breath. Evelyn squeezed her hand. There was no response. Not yet. But not yet still meant there was hope. Her pulse held. She was still breathing. A few more minutes. Anton tilted his head back, eyes closed, muttering something ancient and unintelligible, perhaps a last prayer for redemption from a man long lost. 5 minutes, 7, 10, no one moved. Then a long beat pierced the air. Everyone spun toward the glass. Emily coughed just once, a soft, fragile sound, but enough to make the world break open. The doctor shouted that she had a cough reflex, that she was still here, still fighting. Claire burst into tears, her face pressed to the cold glass, sobbing like rain. James stepped back, covering his face with one trembling hand, his shoulders shaking as silent tears fell, the tears of a father who had just been given back. The most precious thing he had once believed was slipping away forever. And they all knew that the road ahead was still uncertain, that danger had not entirely passed. But in that moment the little girl had wrested victory from death itself, and every person in that room had, in some quiet way, triumphed over their own darkness. Emily lay still as though in a deep sleep, her long lashes trembling faintly when the overhead light brushed the corner of her eyes, and the vital monitors continued their steady rhythm, her heartbeat and oxygen levels gradually returning to a margin of safety. Outside the glass, the entire room held its breath in silence, no one daring to speak for fear of shattering the fragile moment unfolding before them. Claire never took her eyes off that small, fragile face, her own heart pounding as if she too were waiting to be awakened. Evelyn murmured softly that the recovery response was progressing, that the brainwave patterns were beginning to show signs of natural activity again, that they were close now. James stood frozen in place. He had witnessed death countless times, had even ordered it without blinking, yet now, with life flickering back inside his daughter, his heart seemed to melt, and his chest tightened until he could hardly breathe. There was no Mafia, no power, no vengeance left in him, only a father waiting for his child to open her eyes. Then, as if a miracle chose the very moment when everyone's hope was fading, Emily's finger moved, just the slightest motion, painfully slow but unmistakably real. Claire held her breath and stepped closer, Evelyn nodding with eyes rimmed red, whispering that it was a conscious reflex, that the child was trying. James staggered back toward the doorway as if unable to believe what he was seeing. Claire lifted the radio and told them to prepare for consciousness, and inside the room the doctors responded instantly, gently checking her pupils, their voices soft as a lullaby calling her back. "Emily, if you can hear me, open your eyes. You do not have to speak. Just open your eyes. We are right here." Outside, James pressed his forehead to the glass, his lips moving with words he had never spoken aloud. After several seconds that felt like entire lifetimes stacked on top of one another, Emily's eyelids fluttered, opening just a narrow slit, her pupils expanding slowly, unfocused at first, then blinking against the light. The room erupted with gasps, broken laughter, and tears that no one could hold back. Claire covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking with emotion overflowing in waves, and Evelyn wrapped her arms around her from behind, whispering that the child had made it, that they had done it. But the one who broke open the most was James. He could no longer stand. He collapsed to his knees right there in the hallway, both hands covering his face as a deep, guttural sob tore its way out of him. The cry of a man who had just been given back a piece of his soul he believed was already lost. No one dared approach him. They simply watched as he shed the last of his cold, impenetrable armor and crumbled in his grief and relief. The powerful James DeLuca disappeared, leaving only a father kneeling on the floor, weeping because his daughter was alive. When he rose, the look he turned on Claire was no longer the gaze of a man accustomed to command, but that of someone carrying gratitude down to his bones. He stepped toward her and gripped her hands with fingers once stained by violence, now trembling. "You saved her. You saved my daughter." Claire, her own vision blurred with tears, nodded gently and said it was not only her, that Anton, Evelyn, and the entire team had done it together. But James shook his head and whispered that she had not only saved Emily, she had saved the last piece of humanity left inside him, thanking her from the deepest part of himself, saying she could not possibly know what it meant. And Claire, looking into his eyes, saw for the first time, not fear, not power, but release, a soul unburdened at last. Inside the room, Emily's eyes were fully open now, hazy as they searched her surroundings. The doctor asked softly if she could hear them, and the girl's lips moved, barely forming sound, but her eyes brightened as they found the familiar face nearby. Then another miracle came. Emily whispered a single word. "Dad." James froze. He rushed to the glass, pressing his forehead against it, whispering through tears that he was there, that everything was all right, that she had come back. And in that instant, in a world full of chaos and loss, a small but immeasurable love had been given back, whole and shining, like a quiet, ordinary miracle. James walked slowly down the hospital corridor as dawn began to spread its dim, pale light through the misted glass panes. And though Emily was now stable in recovery, and Claire lay asleep in a waiting room chair after 36 straight hours without rest, James could not sleep, not until everything was finished. He stared at the blurred photograph on his phone, Casero seated among the last of his loyal men, expression untouched, as if nothing had happened, as if he believed he had won, as if the attack on the hospital had been the final strike. But James had been waiting for this precise moment, and with the cold intellect and far-sighted instinct that had made him both feared and untouchable, he had prepared a move even Casero could never foresee. He returned to the temporary operations room, where Mason, his arm bandaged, was reviewing the camera footage from the breach, and the man rose immediately when James entered, saying that everything was ready and all they needed was a single signal. James nodded, his voice calm yet forged of steel, and ordered him to send the full audio recording of Casaro's conversation with the corrupt police lieutenant to the inboxes of 3 major news networks, along with the drug trade documents Casero once believed destroyed. Mason moved swiftly, and in only moments the trap set years ago came alive, because long ago James had embedded a private tracking layer onto every one of Casaro's transactions, meaning the man had never known that each transfer, each warehouse change, each silent deal had been recorded, preserved like a nightmare waiting to wake, and now James was choosing to awaken it, not with guns or knives, but with the one weapon Casero never believed could kill him, truth and justice. Anton stepped in, weak from the ordeal yet carrying a different expression now, warning that Casero still had soldiers, and that desperation might drive him to kill again. But James turned back with eyes as cold as winter steel, and said that there were no soldiers left for him, that by tonight he would have no place to hide, that the police could not save him, that his own men would not remain loyal once he was exposed, and that with a few details James had anonymously passed to the prosecutors, a national security warrant would be issued within the hour. Not because Casero was Mafia, but because he had become a threat to the nation itself. Claire awoke when she received word that James had left the hospital alone, without guards, without weapons, and she panicked, asking Evelyn where he had gone, only to be handed a small note in James's hand thanking her for saving Emily and telling her he would now repay the debt. Claire clutched the note and called Mason, but he said nothing, because he knew James did not need anyone beside him for this. This was the final battle, and James intended to fight it his way, with his mind and his honor. James appeared at an old bar Casero once used for private meetings, and inside Casero laughed loud among the few remaining loyalists, convinced his work was done, until 15 minutes later, when his phone began to ring non-stop. News alerts exploding across the screen, leaked documents, secret transactions, extracted videos, Images of him standing beside the body of a missing witness, and Casero's face drained of color as he barked frantic orders for his men to pack up, unaware that he was already too late. When he stepped outside, James stood waiting in the alley, unarmed, but with eyes that carried the weight of judgment itself. Casero snarled that James could not kill him with news, that he was Casero, that he had money and men, but James simply shook his head and told him no one believed him anymore, that his men had already fled. Casero spun around to find his loyalists gone, his phone falling to the pavement, its screen flashing the notification for a nationwide arrest warrant. James stepped forward, picked up the phone, and placed it in Casero's hand, speaking slowly, telling him he had spared him once years ago because he refused to become the kind of man Casero was, but that this time he did not need to kill him at all. He only needed to let him live long enough to watch his entire world collapse. Casero lunged at him in fury, but a shadow moved faster. Mason emerged from the far end of the alley, tackled him to the ground, and cuffed him, just as patrol cars screeched to a halt and blue and red lights flooded the dim sky. James stood still, watching Casero dragged away, his face no longer twisted with rage but eased with something lighter, as if a long-buried weight had finally been lifted. At last he had paid his old debt, not with blood but with truth, not with vengeance but with intelligence, and a newfound faith in justice he once believed did not exist, and he knew that when he returned to the hospital, he would not only be returning to his daughter, but also stepping into an entirely new chapter of his life, one without shadows. News of Casero's arrest spread like a breaking wave through the morning broadcasts, appearing on every television channel, across social media, and on the front pages of worn paper newspapers sold from old sidewalk stands. The crime lord who once made the entire legal system hesitate now sat slumped in a high-security holding cell, hands cuffed, eyes dull like a man waking from a dream of power he thought would never end. The leaked data James had released carved deep into the heart of Casero's empire. Close allies abandoned him one by one, his laundering accounts were frozen, hidden warehouses raided, and countless pieces of irrefutable evidence piled up like the final strokes of a verdict he could no longer outrun. Casero did not scream, did not fight. He simply stared at the gray ceiling above him and understood that the game was over. He had not been brought down by bullets or betrayal, but by the very man he once believed too frightened to act. James had won, and this time he had won without shedding a drop of blood. Meanwhile, in the hospital, Emily was slowly recovering. Claire entered the room just as Evelyn was reading a children's book in a voice soft as drifting wind. Emily turned her head, her eyes lighting up when she saw Claire. She was still weak, but the smile on her lips had returned. Claire moved closer, taking her small hand, feeling the warmth that had been absent for so long. She asked gently if Emily could eat, and the girl whispered that she had eaten a little porridge but wanted ice cream. Claire laughed, emotion swelling through her chest like a rising tide, telling her she would have ice cream very soon. James stepped in moments later, his face no longer hardened by days of battle but lit with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man who had lived his life in shadows. He sat beside his daughter, brushing her hair with a trembling hand, apologizing softly for not being able to protect her from everything, telling her she was safe now, and that he was safe too. Emily nodded and drifted into the deepest, most peaceful sleep she had known in weeks. When she slept, James signaled for Claire to follow him into a quiet hallway. They stopped by a large window overlooking the hospital courtyard, where the pale autumn sun glowed on rows of yellowing trees. He looked at her for a long moment before speaking, his voice low and sincere. He told her he had kept his word, that Casero would never hurt anyone again, that she no longer had to run or live among shadows. Claire nodded, eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall, telling him she knew he would succeed, that he was not the man she once believed him to be. James gave a faint smile and admitted she was not who he expected either. When he had ordered her taken off the street, all he saw was a lonely, suspicious homeless woman, never imagining that while he searched the world for the best mind alive, the person he needed most was shivering on a sidewalk waiting for someone to give her a chance. Claire met his gaze and told him she did not need his pity. James shook his head, saying he owed her something far greater than pity. He owed her a beginning. He reached into his pocket and handed her a folder and a small ring of keys. It was the deed to an old medical clinic he had just purchased in a struggling neighborhood in the southern part of Brooklyn, a place that needed a clinic, needed someone who knew how to listen, someone like her. Her name was already printed on the license, listed as medical director, accompanied by a 3-year grant. Claire stared at him, stunned, asking why. James answered with a quiet smile, saying she had saved his daughter, and he wanted Emily to grow up in a world shaped by people like Claire. He told her she did not simply heal bodies, she gave people hope. Claire stood speechless. For a long time she had stopped dreaming of anything at all. But now, standing in a hallway filled with the footprints of despair and survival, she understood this was not a reward. This was the life she thought she had lost, returned to her in a form she could finally hold, and she would live it with everything she had, just as she had held on to Emily, held on to herself, in a storm that once seemed impossible to escape. The air was crisp as Claire stood in front of the old 2-story building tucked into the corner of a working-class neighborhood in the southern part of Brooklyn. Its once peeling facade had been painted anew in a soft gray-blue, and a simple wooden sign hung beside the door, carved with a name that carried more weight than any title she had ever earned: Marcus Health Center. She lifted her hand and brushed her fingertips across the letters, touching each one as if touching a living memory. His name, Marcus, the man who had taught her what compassion in medicine truly meant, the man whose death had left a hollow ache she carried for so many years. Now, that name was written above the place where she would begin again, not to erase the past, but to honor what had been lost. Inside, the reception room still smelled faintly of fresh paint, but everything else was ready. Evelyn was checking the ultrasound machine, while Mason installed the security system. Anton sat at the main clinic desk, reviewing the list of medications and the low-cost treatment protocols he had helped her assemble for patients with limited means. None of them took payment for these first days of work. They said it was something they needed to do for Emily, for James, and for themselves. The door swung open as James stepped in, holding a simple bouquet of white chrysanthemums and a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Claire and stepped back, watching her with the quiet pride of a father sending a child into a new chapter. She opened the note. It was a handwritten letter, just a few lines from Emily. The girl wrote that she wanted to grow up to be a doctor like Claire, because doctors could heal not only bodies, but also the things people could not put into words. Claire folded the letter, her eyes stinging though her smile remained soft. She walked slowly through the clinic, checking everything one last time. The medicine cabinet was organized by color codes. The private consultation room had a small corner set aside for homeless patients. The vaccine refrigerator hummed steadily, and sunlight poured through the window in a way that made the place feel warmer than most buildings in this neighborhood ever managed to be. She knew that people here rarely visited hospitals until it was too late, not because they did not care about their health, but because they feared they could not afford the price of being heard. When the clock chimed 10, Claire stepped outside and unlocked the front door of Marcus Health Center for the very first time. A frail, elderly woman stood waiting with a wooden cane, and behind her, a thin old man clutched his chest as he tried to catch his breath. Claire smiled and welcomed them in as if they were honored guests at the beginning of a hopeful journey. There were no opening ceremonies, no cameras, no reporters, only ordinary people, people long overlooked, being greeted by someone who once believed she no longer had a place in this world. After examining the elderly woman and scheduling a follow-up appointment for the old man, Claire sat at the desk and filled out the first medical chart bearing her own name beneath the sign of her clinic. She looked out the window, where sunlight filtered through the trees and fell across a street littered with golden leaves, and she felt a peace she had not known in years. That afternoon, Emily arrived with James. The girl wore a blue beanie and held a small gift box in her hands. Claire opened it to find a child's drawing in bright crayon strokes, her and Emily standing side by side, with a building behind them labeled Marcus Health Center. In the corner, she noticed a slanted line of careful, uneven handwriting. "Thank you for not giving up." Claire pulled the girl into her arms and held her tight without saying a word. Some gratitude did not need to be spoken aloud, and some lives only needed a single chance to be rewritten. Marcus Health Center was more than a clinic. It was the proof of a journey that stretched from a cold sidewalk to a place where light finally touched the heart. And Claire, at last, had found her way home. By the end of that autumn, the last leaves drifted gently onto the sidewalk in front of Marcus Health Center, where Claire opened the door each day with a sincere smile and eyes full of quiet hope. Inside the sunlit rooms, the laughter of children echoed from the play corner. The soft tapping of Evelyn's keyboard blended with the familiar footsteps of Mason, and now and then came the gentle cough of an elderly patient, seeking not only treatment, but the comfort of being heard. Claire still wore Marcus's old bracelet as a reminder that she did not walk this path alone. Marcus was gone, but the love and knowledge he left behind lived on in every patient she healed, in every grateful gaze from someone who once believed the world had forgotten them. James often brought Emily to visit on weekends. The girl smiled more now, running through the small garden behind the clinic where Claire grew lavender to freshen the air. Each time he saw his daughter healthy and laughing, James would stand still for a long, quiet moment before resting his hand on Claire's shoulder, the way a father offers wordless thanks to the person who saved his child from the edge of death. He was no longer a powerful crime figure, but a father, a man learning perhaps for the first time how to live with decency and grace. One afternoon, Claire was invited to speak at a small community forum at the local cultural center, standing on a simple stage before factory workers, retirees, and homeless individuals she had treated for free. She told her story not as a hero but as someone who had once lost her way and been given a second chance. She spoke about Marcus, about loss, about the version of herself who once slept on a sidewalk, and about Emily, the little girl who rekindled her belief in miracles. She ended with a sentence that left the entire room silent for a long, breathless moment. Forgiveness is not forgetting the past, but allowing the future the chance to be rewritten with something better. When the event ended, an older man approached her with red-rimmed eyes, shaking her hand. He told her that because of her story, he had decided to go find his son again after 10 years of silence. And in that moment, Claire understood that every sacrifice, every wound, every reckless choice she once made, all of it had been worth it. My dear friend, did this story touch your heart? Have you ever found yourself in a place where just a small flicker of light was enough to pull you out of the dark? If you were Claire, would you have had the courage to risk everything to save a stranger's life? Please leave a comment below and share your feelings and reflections about this deeply human journey. We would be honored to hear the truths that live in your heart. It is more than interaction, it is connection, empathy, and the way we heal one another through stories. If you found meaning in this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like the video, and share it so that more people can experience the compassion, the life lessons, and the honest emotions carried through each tale. Every share you offer becomes our motivation to continue bringing heartfelt, inspiring stories to you each day. Thank you for spending your time with us. Wishing you good health, a joyful life, and a peaceful, meaningful day ahead. We look forward to seeing you in our next video, where life stories continue to be told with all the heart we have. Goodbye, and until next time.